In the sun-drenched, dust-moated lands of the Levant, where the echoes of ancient prophets mingled with the clang of crusader steel, a child was born who would inherit not merely a kingdom, but a crucible. It was the year of our Lord 1161, and in the fortified city of Jerusalem, nestled amidst hills that had witnessed millennia of human drama, a boy named Baldwin drew his first breath. He was the son of Amalric I, King of Jerusalem, and Agnes of Courtenay, a union of powerful Frankish lineages in an age when lineage was destiny. This crusader kingdom, a fragile jewel carved from the heart of the Islamic world, was a place of perpetual tension, a vibrant tapestry woven with threads of faith, ambition, and an ever-present threat of war. Baldwin's early years, though brief, were steeped in the unique atmosphere of Outremer, the lands beyond the sea. He would have heard the murmur of Latin prayers in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the distant call to prayer from Muslim minarets, and the clatter of hooves on cobbled streets as knights in their distinctive surcoats rode by. The air itself, heavy with the scent of spices and the dry earth, carried the weight of history. His father, Amalric, was a king of considerable intellect and ambition, striving to consolidate his precarious realm amidst powerful Muslim neighbors like Nur al-Din, the formidable ruler of Damascus and Aleppo. Young Baldwin, as the heir apparent, was destined for a life of leadership, though none could foresee the tragic irony that fate held in store. His education began early, as was customary for royalty. He was placed under the tutelage of William of Tyre, an erudite scholar, chronicler, and later Archbishop of Tyre, whose writings provide much of what we know about this period. William was a man of vast learning, fluent in several languages, including Arabic, and possessed a keen understanding of both theology and politics. He taught Baldwin Latin, history, and the intricate art of governance, preparing him for the heavy mantle of kingship. It was William, in fact, who first noticed the subtle, insidious signs of the disease that would define Baldwin's life. During a playful moment with other noble children, William observed that Baldwin did not recoil when pinched, nor did he cry out in pain. This peculiar numbness, particularly in his right arm, was dismissed at first, perhaps as a childish peculiarity or a momentary distraction. But as the years passed, the symptoms became more pronounced, the numbness spreading, the skin hardening, the disfigurement beginning its slow, relentless march. The disease was leprosy, a scourge that carried not only physical devastation, but also profound social stigma in the medieval world. For a king, especially one in a martial society like the Crusader states, such an affliction was a cruel twist of fate. It threatened to undermine the very foundation of his authority, as a monarch was expected to lead his armies, to be a figure of strength and vitality. The diagnosis, though not definitively confirmed until later in his adolescence, cast a long, dark shadow over the hopes for Baldwin's reign. His father, Amalric, passed away unexpectedly in 1174, leaving the throne vacant. Baldwin, barely 13 years old, and with the early signs of his illness becoming undeniable, was crowned King of Jerusalem. It was a moment of profound vulnerability for the kingdom. A minor on the throne, especially one afflicted with a debilitating disease, was a recipe for instability. The regency fell to Raymond III of Tripoli, a powerful and astute count who wisely sought to maintain the fragile peace and prepare the young king for his daunting responsibilities. Despite his burgeoning illness, Baldwin displayed remarkable qualities. William of Tyre, his former tutor and now a keen observer of his reign, described him as a young man of striking intelligence, sharp wit, and an innate sense of royal dignity. He was said to be a skilled horseman, even as his hands began to lose their grip and his body betrayed him. He learned to compensate for his physical limitations with mental acuity and strategic thinking. He understood the precarious position of his kingdom, surrounded by increasingly unified and powerful Muslim forces under the leadership of Saladin, who was rapidly consolidating his control over Egypt and Syria. The political landscape Baldwin inherited was complex and treacherous. The Crusader states, though a formidable presence for over a century, were always on the defensive. They relied on a delicate balance of diplomacy, strategic alliances, and military prowess to survive. Internally, there were factions among the Frankish nobility, rivalries that often threatened to unravel the kingdom from within. Baldwin, despite his youth and illness, had to navigate these treacherous currents, asserting his authority while relying on the counsel of his regents and advisors. One of the lesser-known details of Baldwin's early reign is the significant role played by his mother, Agnes of Courtenay, who, despite having been divorced by his father for political reasons, returned to prominence as a powerful influence at court. She was a controversial figure, often accused by chroniclers like William of Tyre of meddling in affairs of state and promoting her own favorites. However, her presence provided a degree of maternal support for the young, ailing king, and she clearly wielded considerable informal power, especially in the early years of his rule. Historians still debate the true extent of her influence and whether it was ultimately detrimental or beneficial to the kingdom. Was she a manipulative schemer, as some sources suggest, or a devoted mother simply trying to protect her son and his inheritance in a cutthroat political environment? The truth likely lies somewhere in the nuanced shades between these extremes. As Baldwin matured, his illness progressed. The visible signs of leprosy became more pronounced: disfigurement of his face, loss of sensation in his limbs, and a gradual weakening of his body. Yet his spirit remained unbroken. He continued to lead his armies, often carried on a litter or riding with great difficulty. His presence on the battlefield a powerful symbol of defiance against both his disease and his enemies. He understood that a king, especially a Crusader king, must embody strength, even when his body was failing him. His most famous military victory came at the Battle of Montgisard in 1177, when he was just 16 years old. Despite being severely outnumbered and suffering from the advanced stages of his disease, Baldwin led a surprise attack against Saladin's much larger forces. The result was a stunning and decisive Frankish victory, a testament to Baldwin's strategic brilliance and the unwavering courage of his knights. Imagine the scene: a young king, his face already marked by illness, riding into the fray, perhaps with a crucifix held aloft, inspiring his men to an improbable triumph. This victory bought the kingdom a brief respite, a precious few years of relative peace. But it could not halt the relentless advance of Saladin's ambitions, nor could it cure Baldwin's incurable disease. The internal struggles within the kingdom intensified as Baldwin's health deteriorated. The question of succession became paramount. Baldwin, knowing he would not have an heir, had to consider who would follow him. His sister, Sibylla, was the natural successor, but her choice of husband was a matter of intense political maneuvering. Should she marry a powerful European noble who could bring aid and resources, or a local lord who understood the intricacies of Outremer? These debates fractured the court, creating deep divisions that would plague the kingdom long after Baldwin's death. Perhaps these walls whispered stories to the stars of a boy king who defied the odds, who fought not only for his kingdom, but against the relentless tide of his own Sioux. Fauffering. He was a king who, despite his physical weakness, commanded respect and loyalty, a testament to his character and leadership. His reign, though tragically short, was marked by moments of remarkable courage and strategic acumen, proving that true strength lay not merely in the body, but in the spirit and the mind. The weight of his inheritance, a kingdom perpetually on the brink, pressed down upon him. Yet he bore it with a dignity that transcended his physical suffering. He knew his time was limited, and every decision, every battle, every diplomatic overture was made with the knowledge that the fate of Jerusalem rested on his frail shoulders. If you're enjoying this, liking and subscribing truly helps and is much appreciated. The sun, a relentless golden orb above Jerusalem, cast long dancing shadows across the courtyards of the royal palace. Within its cool stone walls, a young prince, barely in his 10th year, moved with the boundless energy of childhood. Baldwin, the eldest son of King Amalric, was a lively boy, his mind quick, his spirit inquisitive. He loved the tales of chivalry, the clatter of swords from the training grounds, and the quiet hours spent with his tutor, William of Tyre, the learned archbishop and chronicler whose keen eyes missed little. It was William, during one of their lessons, who first noticed something amiss. They were in the gardens, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and the distant murmur of the city. Baldwin, engrossed in a passage from Livy, paused to brush an insect from his arm. William observed that the boy did not flinch, nor did he seem to register the bite. He inquired, gently, if the prince felt anything. Baldwin, looking up with bright, innocent eyes, simply shrugged. "No, Master William, I feel nothing there." A flicker of unease passed through William. He had heard of such things, though rarely in one so young. He made a mental note, dismissing it as a momentary numbness, perhaps from leaning awkwardly. But then other small incidents began to accumulate. A minor burn from a candle flame during an evening reading, unnoticed by Baldwin until William pointed out the reddened skin. A small cut on his hand from a thorny rosebush in the garden, which bled without the prince registering any pain. Each time, Baldwin's response was the same, a casual shrug, a lack of sensation that was, to William, increasingly unsettling. These were the first whispers of a devastating truth, subtle at first, easily overlooked in the vibrant chaos of a royal household. The court physicians, consulted discreetly by William, offered various explanations: a pinched nerve, a childish insensitivity to minor discomfort, perhaps even a touch of the sun. The word leprosy was a specter, a dread that no one dared voice aloud, especially not concerning the heir to the throne. It was a disease of the outcast, of the marginalized, a cruel irony for a prince destined to rule. Yet, as the months turned into a year, and Baldwin approached his 11th birthday, the signs became more pronounced, harder to ignore. The numbness, initially localized, began to spread, subtly affecting other areas of his skin. The texture of his skin, once smooth and youthful, began to show faint, almost imperceptible changes, a slight discoloration, a subtle thickening in places. The boy, still full of life and intelligence, continued his studies, excelled in his riding, and charmed those around him with his wit and gentle demeanor. But beneath the surface, a silent, insidious enemy was taking root. One particular incident, recounted later by William of Tyre himself, cemented the growing fears into a chilling certainty. It was during a playful wrestling match between young Baldwin and his friends, a boisterous affair in the palace courtyard. In the rough and tumble, Baldwin's arm was scraped against the rough stone wall. A deep gash appeared, bleeding freely. His companions cried out in concern, but Baldwin merely looked at his arm with a detached curiosity. No wince, no gasp of pain. William, witnessing this, felt a cold dread settle in his heart. He knew then, with a terrible certainty, what was afflicting his beloved pupil. The diagnosis, when it finally came, was delivered with hushed voices and heavy hearts. It was a gradual process, not a single dramatic pronouncement. It involved multiple examinations by the most skilled physicians of the kingdom, their faces growing grimmer with each passing week. They observed the characteristic loss of sensation, the developing skin lesions, the subtle but unmistakable signs that pointed to Hansen's disease, or leprosy, as it was then known. The news was kept a closely guarded secret within the inner circle. Of the court, a devastating blow to King Amalric and his queen, Agnes of Courtenay. The implications were staggering. In the 12th century, leprosy carried not only a physical toll, but a profound social and spiritual stigma. It was often seen as a divine punishment, a mark of sin, and those afflicted were typically ostracized, forced to live in leper colonies, separated from society. For a king, such a diagnosis was almost unthinkable. How could a monarch, chosen by God, lead his people if he bore the mark of such a dreaded illness? The very notion of kingship, tied so closely to physical perfection and divine favor, was challenged to its core. Historians still debate the precise strain of leprosy that afflicted Baldwin, and indeed, the exact age at which the disease became undeniably evident. Some modern medical analyses, based on historical descriptions, suggest it might have been a form of lepromatous leprosy, which tends to be more aggressive and visible, while others argue for a tuberculoid form, which can be less disfiguring but still causes nerve damage and loss of sensation. The medical understanding of the time was rudimentary, and treatments were non-existent beyond palliative care and isolation. What is clear is that the disease progressed, slowly but inexorably, shaping not only Baldwin's body, but his destiny. The young prince, perhaps sensing the shift in the adults around him, the hushed tones and sorrowful glances, began to understand that something profound was happening to him. He was a bright boy, and the subtle changes in his own body, the way his limbs sometimes felt alien, the growing patches of numbness, could not be entirely hidden from his own awareness. He witnessed the sorrow in his father's eyes, the quiet despair of his mother. The carefree days of childhood began to recede, replaced by a growing awareness of his unique and tragic circumstances. King Amalric, a pragmatic and devoted father, faced an agonizing dilemma. His son, his heir, was afflicted with a disease that threatened to undermine the very stability of the kingdom. Yet he loved Baldwin deeply and was determined to protect him and ensure his future. The king's reign was already fraught with external pressures, the constant threat from Saladin, the ambitious Muslim leader consolidating power in Egypt and Syria, and the complex internal politics of the Crusader states, a fragile collection of European outposts in a hostile land. Now this personal tragedy added an unbearable weight to his crown. The court became a place of quiet anxiety. The knights, the nobles, the common folk of Jerusalem all held their breath, waiting for the official word, for the inevitable truth to be revealed. The news, despite the efforts to contain it, began to leak out in whispers, carried on the desert winds, from the palace walls to the bustling markets. A prince touched by God, but perhaps in a way no one desired. Perhaps these walls, built centuries ago by the faithful, whispered stories to the stars of the kings and queens who had walked their halls, of triumphs and tragedies. Now they held the secret of a young boy's fate, a fate that would soon define an entire era. The gentle boy, Baldwin, was unknowingly stepping onto a path unlike any king before him, a path of immense courage and profound suffering. His youth, once a boundless expanse of possibility, was now shadowed by the encroaching reality of his illness. The carefree prince was slowly, inexorably, transforming into the Leper King, a title that would forever be etched into the annals of history, a testament to a life lived against overwhelming odds. The sun continued its relentless cycle, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding beneath its gaze. Yet for Baldwin, its warmth would soon become a distant memory, replaced by the chilling touch of a disease that would steal his sensations, but never his spirit. The summer air in Jerusalem, usually thick with the scent of dust and spices, now carried a subtle undertone of anxiety. Baldwin IV, though crowned king, remained a child, his frail hand gripping a scepter too heavy for him. The true weight of the kingdom, however, rested upon the shoulders of Raymond III of Tripoli, a man of considerable experience and shrewd intellect who had been appointed regent. His task was unenviable: to guide a realm besieged by internal rivalries and an increasingly formidable external threat, all while the young king, still a boy of 13, began to show the first undeniable signs of a devastating illness. The regency of Raymond III was not without its immediate challenges. The very appointment of a regent, while necessary, often stirred the pot of noble ambition. There were those within the high court of Jerusalem who felt their own claims to power were stronger, their wisdom greater, or their lineage more direct. These undercurrents of discontent, though often subtle, created a constant hum beneath the surface of courtly life, a quiet tension that could erupt into open factionalism at any moment. Raymond, a seasoned politician, navigated these treacherous waters with a blend of diplomacy and firmness. But the energy expended on maintaining internal cohesion was energy diverted from addressing the gathering storm beyond the kingdom's borders. The most pressing concern, however, was the health of the young king. The numbness in Baldwin's arm, first dismissed as a minor ailment, had spread, and the characteristic loss of sensation, coupled with the telltale skin lesions, left little doubt among the physicians. It was leprosy, a diagnosis that cast a long, dark shadow over the future of the kingdom. The disease, then incurable and widely misunderstood, carried with it not only physical debilitation, but also a profound social stigma. While Baldwin, as king, would be afforded every comfort and care, the very notion of a leper on the throne was unsettling to many. It raised questions of succession, of divine favor, and of the kingdom's long-term stability. The initial years of Raymond's regency, roughly from 1174 to 1176, were a delicate balancing act. He sought to consolidate power, not for his own gain, but to ensure the kingdom's survival. He understood that a strong, unified front was the only way to face the rising power of Saladin. Saladin, having consolidated his control over Egypt and much of Syria, was now poised to turn his full attention to the Crusader states. His ambition was clear: to reclaim Jerusalem for Islam, a goal he pursued with a strategic brilliance and relentless determination that would soon become legendary. One of Raymond's key strategies was to secure alliances and maintain a fragile peace where possible, buying time for the kingdom to strengthen itself. He understood that direct confrontation with Saladin, given the kingdom's internal divisions and limited resources, would be disastrous. This approach, however, often put him at odds with the more hawkish elements within the Crusader nobility, particularly those eager for military glory or quick territorial gains. These differing philosophies on how to deal with Saladin would become a recurring source of friction throughout Baldwin's reign. A lesser-known detail from this period concerns the intricate diplomatic dance between the Crusader states and the Byzantine Empire. Though often fraught with suspicion and rivalry, there were moments when common interests brought them together. Raymond III, recognizing the strategic importance of Byzantine naval power and financial resources, sought to revive alliances, particularly in the face of Saladin's growing strength. There were even discussions, though ultimately fruitless, of joint military ventures against Saladin in Egypt, a testament to the perceived threat he posed to both Christian and Byzantine interests in the region. These diplomatic overtures, often conducted through secret emissaries and coded messages, highlight the complex geopolitical landscape of the time, where alliances shifted like desert sands. The years passed, and Baldwin, though still young, began to assert himself. The Regency formally ended in 1176, when he reached the age of 15, the traditional age of majority. Despite his worsening condition, Baldwin possessed a keen intellect and a remarkable strength of will. He had been tutored by William of Tyre, the renowned historian and archbishop, who instilled in him a deep understanding of governance and a profound sense of duty. William, who had observed the young king closely, noted his unusual maturity and sharp mind, even as his body began its slow decline. However, the end of the Regency did not mean the end of Raymond's influence. He remained a powerful figure, a seasoned statesman whose counsel was often sought, even if not always followed. The transition from Regency to the king's direct rule was not entirely smooth. The court remained a hotbed of competing factions. One significant group coalesced around Agnes of Courtenay, Baldwin's mother, and her brother, Jocelyn III. They represented a more aggressive stance towards Saladin, advocating for preemptive strikes and a less cautious approach than Raymond. This faction, often referred to as the court party, gained increasing influence as Baldwin's health deteriorated, creating a persistent tension with Raymond and his supporters, who favored a more defensive and diplomatic strategy. Historians still debate the true extent of Agnes of Courtenay's political influence. Was she a manipulative figure, pulling strings from behind the scenes to advance her family's interests, as some contemporary chroniclers suggest? Or was she simply a concerned mother, seeking to protect her son and ensure the stability of his reign in the face of an incurable illness, as others argue? The truth likely lies somewhere in between, a complex interplay of maternal devotion, personal ambition, and the harsh realities of medieval power politics. What is clear is that her presence at court, coupled with her strong personality, added another layer of complexity to the already intricate web of relationships surrounding the young king. The external threat, meanwhile, continued to loom large. Saladin, having achieved a significant victory over the Zengids in Syria, now controlled a vast swathe of territory that encircled the Crusader states. His strategic brilliance was evident in his ability to unite disparate Muslim factions under his banner, a feat that had eluded many before him. He understood the importance of propaganda and religious fervor, portraying his campaigns as a jihad to reclaim Holy Lands. His forces were well-disciplined and highly motivated, a stark contrast to the often divided and squabbling Crusader armies. One of the key moments during this period was the Battle of Montgisard in 1177. Despite his debilitating illness, Baldwin IV, then 16, led the Crusader army against Saladin's much larger forces. It was a desperate gamble, a moment of extraordinary courage that defied the expectations of many. Saladin, confident in his numerical superiority, had advanced deep into Crusader territory, seemingly unaware of the resolve of the young king and his men. The battle was a stunning and unexpected victory for the Crusaders. Baldwin, despite his physical weakness, fought with remarkable ferocity, inspiring his troops. The image of the young Leper King, riding at the head of his army, holding aloft the true cross, became a powerful symbol of defiance and faith. The victory at Montgisard, while a significant morale boost, did not fundamentally alter the strategic balance of power. It bought the kingdom some breathing room, but it did not diminish Saladin's long-term ambitions. It merely served as a temporary setback for him, a lesson in underestimating his opponents. For Baldwin, however, it cemented his image as a warrior king. A figure of remarkable resilience who, despite his affliction, was determined to defend his realm. This victory, perhaps more than any other event, showcased the paradoxical nature of his reign. A king whose body was failing, but whose spirit remained indomitable. The aftermath of Montgisard saw a brief period of truce, but the underlying tensions remained. The internal squabbles within the Crusader states continued, often hindering effective defense. The kingdom's resources were finite, and the constant need for military readiness drained its coffers. The population, too, felt the strain of perpetual warfare, with trade routes disrupted and agricultural lands often devastated by raids. The atmosphere in Jerusalem, though still vibrant, carried a pervasive sense of foreboding, a quiet understanding that the peace was merely a lull before the next storm. Raymond III, though no longer regent, continued to advocate for a pragmatic approach, often clashing with the more aggressive elements at court. He believed in fortifying key strongholds, maintaining a strong defensive posture, and engaging in diplomacy to avoid unnecessary conflict. His vision was one of long-term survival, understanding that the kingdom could not win a war of attrition against Saladin's vast resources. However, his cautious approach was often perceived as weakness by those who yearned for a more decisive, offensive war. This fundamental disagreement over strategy would continue to plague the kingdom throughout Baldwin's reign, weakening its ability to present a united front. Perhaps these walls whispered stories to the stars, tales of a young king's quiet suffering, of a regent's weary diplomacy, and of the relentless march of an empire builder. The stones of Jerusalem, ancient and weathered, had witnessed countless struggles, but few as poignant as the battle waged by a boy king against an unseen enemy within his own body and a formidable foe at his borders. The kingdom, like its monarch, was in flux, constantly adapting, constantly struggling, its fate hanging precariously in the balance. The Regency had ended, but the trials of Baldwin IV, the Leper King, had only just begun. The stage was set for a series of dramatic confrontations that would define the era and ultimately shape the destiny of the Crusader states. The desert winds, so often a relentless sculptor of dunes and rock, now seemed to carry a different kind of burden. The weight of anticipation, a tangible hum that vibrated through the very air of the Latin East. Whispers of Saladin's grand design had reached Jerusalem, carried by breathless scouts and terrified villagers fleeing the encroaching shadow. He was not merely raiding, he was moving with purpose, a vast host, perhaps 25,000 strong, sweeping down from Egypt, intent on severing the southern heart of the Crusader kingdom. Gaza, Ascalon, Ramla, these coastal strongholds, vital arteries of trade and defense, lay directly in his path. Baldwin IV, though barely 16, understood the gravity of the moment with a chilling clarity that belied his youth. His body, a fragile vessel increasingly besieged by the insidious progress of his illness, might have been failing. But his mind remained a sharp, strategic instrument. He was in Jerusalem when the news arrived, the city's ancient stones seeming to hold their breath. To surrender these crucial fortresses was to invite a slow, agonizing strangulation of his kingdom. To confront Saladin with the forces at his disposal, however, seemed an act of suicidal folly. The Crusader army, a patchwork quilt of knights, sergeants, and local levies, numbered a mere few hundred knights, and perhaps a few thousand foot soldiers. A stark, almost laughable contrast to Saladin's overwhelming numbers. Some accounts place the Christian force at no more than 375 knights and a few thousand infantry, perhaps 5,000 in total, though the precise figures, like so many details from that distant era, are debated among historians. Yet Baldwin, despite the counsel of caution, perhaps even despair, from some of his advisors, made a decision that would etch his name into the annals of military history. He would not wait behind walls. He would ride out. This was not a choice born of recklessness, but of a desperate, audacious hope. He knew that to allow Saladin to consolidate his gains, to pick off the coastal cities one by one, would be to sign the death warrant of Jerusalem itself. A sudden, unexpected blow, however improbable, might just shatter the Ayyubid momentum. And so, with a courage that burned brighter than any fever, the young king, his arm already losing sensation, his face perhaps already showing the telltale signs of his affliction, mounted his horse. He rode first to Ascalon, a city whose very name resonated with ancient echoes, a strategic port that had seen countless sieges and triumphs. There, he was joined by the Knights Templar, their white mantles emblazoned with the Red Cross, and the Knights Hospitaller, their black habits bearing the White Cross, the elite fighting forces of the Latin East. Hardened by years of skirmishes and crusades, Reynald of Châtillon, Lord of Ultra-Jourdain, a man whose fiery temperament and unwavering resolve were as legendary as his often controversial actions, also brought his contingent. Reynald, a figure of immense power and equally immense controversy, had only recently been released from years of captivity in Aleppo, and his return to the political and military stage was a significant, if at times volatile, factor. From Ascalon, the small Crusader army began its march northward, shadowing Saladin's movements, a tiny, defiant speck against the vastness of the desert. Saladin, confident in his overwhelming numerical superiority, had made a strategic miscalculation. He believed Baldwin would remain holed up in Jerusalem, or at best attempt to reinforce one of the besieged cities. He had split his forces, sending detachments to plunder the rich plains around Ramla, Lydda, and Arsuf, spreading his troops out in the pursuit of spoils and the terrorization of the local populace. This dispersion, born of overconfidence, would prove to be his undoing. On the morning of November 25, 1177, the Christian army, exhausted but resolute, found itself near Montgisard, a place whose name would forever be linked to this improbable victory. The terrain was challenging, a mixture of plains and low hills, but it offered a crucial advantage. It allowed the smaller Crusader force to remain largely concealed until the last moment. Saladin, having allowed his army to become widely dispersed in their plundering, was caught completely by surprise. His main force, stretched thin and burdened with loot, was suddenly confronted by the sight of the Crusader banner, the Cross of Jerusalem, unfurling on the horizon. What followed was a moment of sheer, unadulterated shock for the Ayyubid forces. The Crusader charge, led by the heavy cavalry, was a force of nature. The Frankish knights, their armor gleaming under the desert sun, their lances lowered, crashed into the disarrayed Muslim ranks with devastating effect. It was not merely a charge, it was a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble. Baldwin, despite his physical weakness, was at the forefront, his presence an almost mythical inspiration to his men. He dismounted before the battle, knelt before a fragment of the true cross carried by the Bishop of Bethlehem, and prayed for victory, then rose, remounted, and led the charge. This act, whether a pious devotion or a shrewd theatrical gesture, galvanized his troops. The Mamluk cavalry, Saladin's elite slave soldiers, renowned for their discipline and prowess, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity and unexpectedness of the attack. The Crusader charge, a concentrated spearhead of steel and faith, punched through their lines, scattering them in confusion. The battle was not a prolonged strategic affair, but a brutal, swift, and utterly decisive rout. Saladin's personal guard, the very core of his army, was decimated. Many of his emirs, his trusted commanders, were killed or captured. Saladin himself narrowly escaped, fleeing on a swift dromedary, his grand campaign shattered, his reputation severely tarnished. The victory at Montgisard was total and unexpected. The Christian losses were minimal, while the Ayyubid army suffered catastrophic casualties. The scale of the defeat was so profound that Saladin's forces were reportedly pursued for miles, their retreat turning into a desperate flight. The desert, which had so recently seemed to hold the promise of conquest for Saladin, now swallowed his broken army, leaving behind a trail of abandoned weapons, supplies, and the bodies of the fallen. This triumph, achieved against such overwhelming odds, sent a ripple of astonishment across the entire region. It showcased Baldwin IV's remarkable military acumen and his unyielding courage. For a young king, already battling a debilitating disease, to not only lead his vastly outnumbered forces, but to achieve such a crushing victory against the most formidable Muslim leader of his age, was nothing short of miraculous. It was a moment of fleeting, glorious hope for the Crusader kingdom, a testament to the enduring, if often fragile, resilience of the Latin presence in the Holy Land. The victory bought Jerusalem a crucial respite, a few more years of relative peace and security. It forced Saladin to retreat to Egypt, to regroup and rebuild his shattered forces, delaying his grand designs for conquest. For Baldwin, it cemented his image as a warrior king, a leader capable of inspiring fierce loyalty and achieving the impossible. Yet even in the glow of this triumph, the shadow of his illness persisted. The physical exertion of the campaign, the stress of command, undoubtedly took a further toll on his already weakened body. Historians still debate the precise impact of his leprosy on his military leadership. Did it sharpen his mind, knowing his time was limited, or did it increasingly hinder his physical presence on the battlefield, forcing him to rely more on his commanders? The accounts suggest a king who, despite his suffering, remained resolute and inspiring, often leading from the front, even as his body betrayed him. The aftermath of Montgisard was a period of cautious optimism in Jerusalem. The immediate threat had been repelled, and the kingdom could breathe a little easier. However, the underlying strategic imbalance remained. Saladin was a formidable foe, and his resources, though temporarily diminished, far outstripped those of the Crusader states. This victory, while glorious, was a temporary reprieve, not a permanent solution. It was a testament to Baldwin's extraordinary leadership, but it also highlighted the precarious existence of the Crusader kingdom, constantly reliant on such improbable acts of defiance. The years that followed Montgisard were a complex tapestry of diplomacy and intermittent conflict. Saladin, stung by his defeat, would eventually rebuild his strength, but for a time, the memory of Montgisard, the image of the young Leper King leading his knights to a stunning victory, served as a powerful deterrent. Perhaps these desert winds, which had witnessed so much bloodshed and triumph, whispered stories of that improbable day to the stars, a tale of courage against overwhelming odds, a moment when a fragile kingdom, led by an even more fragile king, stared down the mightiest empire of its age and emerged victorious. The victory at Montgisard became a foundational legend, a cornerstone of Baldwin IV's legacy, a beacon of what could be achieved through sheer will and audacious strategy, even as the encroaching darkness of his illness continued its relentless advance. As the years drifted by, the gentle rhythm of Jerusalem's days continued, but within the royal chambers, a subtle yet profound shift began to unfold. The disease that had first manifested as a numb patch on a young boy's arm, an unfeeling spot on his skin, started its relentless, insidious march. It was not a sudden dramatic collapse, but a gradual, almost imperceptible erosion, like a river slowly carving its path through stone. Baldwin, still in the full bloom of his youth, found his body increasingly betraying him. The early numbness began to spread, transforming into a loss of sensation in his extremities, particularly his hands and feet. Simple tasks that he once performed with ease, holding a quill, gripping a sword hilt, or even guiding his horse's reins, became increasingly challenging, then impossible. The once nimble fingers that had traced maps of the kingdom or clutched the cross during prayer now curled, losing their dexterity and strength. His feet, once firm upon the earth, grew weak, making walking a labored effort. The disease, now unmistakably leprosy, was not merely a cosmetic affliction. It was a deep, systemic assault on his nervous system, and eventually on his very musculature. The visible signs, though still discreet in these early stages of progression, were beginning to emerge: a thickening of the skin, a subtle distortion of features, a growing fragility. It was a cruel irony that a king, whose very presence was meant to embody strength and divine favor, was slowly being consumed by an illness that rendered him vulnerable and dependent. This physical deterioration, heartbreaking to witness for those who loved him, inevitably cast a long shadow over the political landscape of the kingdom. A king's health was not merely a personal matter, it was inextricably linked to the stability and perception of his rule. A strong, vigorous monarch inspired confidence, both domestically and among neighboring powers. A king weakened by illness, however, invited speculation, ambition, and most dangerously, internal strife. The very air within the court seemed to thicken with unspoken anxieties and thinly veiled aspirations. The court of Jerusalem was, by its very nature, a tapestry woven from diverse threads: native-born Franks, seasoned Crusader knights, newly arrived pilgrims, and the established noble families who had carved out their fiefdoms in the Levant. Among these, two factions began to assert themselves with increasing vigor, circling the ailing king like predators around a weakening prey. These were the Courtenays and the Lusignans, families whose ambitions and rivalries would come to define much of Baldwin's later reign. The Courtenays, a prominent family with deep roots in the Latin East, were represented most notably by Jocelyn III, Count of Edessa. Though Edessa itself had fallen decades prior, the title carried immense prestige, and Jocelyn was a seasoned, pragmatic figure. He was Baldwin's maternal uncle, a close blood relation, and had served as a regent during the king's minority. His influence stemmed from his experience, his familial ties to the royal house, and his considerable landholdings. He understood the delicate balance of power in the Crusader states and generally advocated for a policy of cautious diplomacy with Saladin, recognizing the kingdom's limited resources. In stark contrast stood the Lusignans, a family of Poitevin origin, relatively new arrivals to the Holy Land, but possessed of an undeniable ambition. Their most prominent figure was Guy of Lusignan, a handsome, charismatic, yet ultimately feckless knight. His brother, Aimery, had already secured a position of influence by marrying into the powerful Ibelin family. Guy's star rose dramatically when he married Sibylla, Baldwin's older sister, in 1180. This marriage was a pivotal moment, for it immediately elevated Guy from a mere knight to a potential heir to the throne, as Sibylla was the next in line after Baldwin. His union, however, was not universally welcomed. Many of the established nobility, particularly the Ibelins and the Courtenay, viewed Guy with suspicion, seeing him as an opportunist, lacking the political acumen and military prowess required to lead the kingdom. The marriage itself was a subject of considerable debate and mystery. Historians still disagree whether Sibylla truly fell in love with Guy, or if the union was primarily a political maneuver orchestrated by certain factions within the court, perhaps even by Agnes of Courtenay, Baldwin's mother, who sought to secure her family's influence. Some accounts suggest that Baldwin himself, recognizing his declining health and the urgent need for a strong male heir, may have been pressured into approving the match. Regardless of the precise motivations, the marriage of Sibylla and Guy immediately created a powerful new faction, one that was perceived by many as aggressive and less inclined to compromise with Saladin. As Baldwin's illness progressed, his physical limitations became more pronounced, and the need for a regent, or at least a strong hand to guide the kingdom, grew increasingly urgent. In 1180, Baldwin made the fateful decision to appoint Guy of Lusignan as regent. This appointment was met with widespread dismay among the established nobility. Raymond III of Tripoli, a powerful and respected figure who had served as regent during Baldwin's minority, felt deeply slighted and withdrew from court. The Ibelins, who had initially supported Guy's brother, were now wary of Guy's ambition and perceived incompetence. The tension between the factions escalated. Guy, now wielding significant power, quickly demonstrated a lack of judgment. In 1182, he launched an unprovoked raid into Saladin's territory, violating a fragile truce. This reckless act infuriated Baldwin, who, despite his failing health, was still very much the king. He was carried on a litter to the front lines, a poignant image of a monarch defying his physical limitations to assert his authority. He personally intervened to prevent further escalation, demonstrating his continued commitment to peace and stability, even as his body betrayed him. This incident proved to be the breaking point for Baldwin's trust in Guy. The king, recognizing Guy's unsuitability for leadership, stripped him of the regency. It was a difficult and painful decision, for it meant publicly humiliating his own brother-in-law, the husband of his potential heir. This act further deepened the rift within the court, solidifying the factions into opposing camps. On one side were those who supported Guy and Sibylla, often seen as the court party, eager for a more aggressive stance against Saladin. On the other were the Barons' party, led by Raymond of Tripoli and the Ibelins, who advocated for a more cautious, pragmatic approach, prioritizing the kingdom's survival over grand, often reckless, military ventures. The kingdom was now caught in a dangerous dance between internal rivalries and external threats. Saladin, ever watchful, observed these internal divisions with keen interest. He understood that a divided kingdom was a vulnerable one. The constant bickering and jockeying for power among the Frankish nobility played directly into his hands, weakening their collective resolve and military readiness. Baldwin, increasingly frail, found himself caught in the middle, a king whose mind remained sharp and strategic, but whose body was failing him. He was forced to rely more and more on others, his daily life a testament to his growing dependence. His once strong voice, though still commanding, sometimes wavered with fatigue. His eyes, though still bright with intelligence, held a weariness that spoke of constant pain and the heavy burden of his crown. The once vibrant royal chambers, filled with the bustling energy of a young king, now often held a hushed solemnity, a quiet acknowledgement of the king's suffering. Despite his physical, loud decline, Baldwin continued to rule with remarkable determination. He understood the profound danger of leaving the succession unresolved, especially with his own life clearly drawing to a close. His sister, Sibylla, was the natural heir, but her marriage to Guy presented a formidable problem. Baldwin knew that entrusting the kingdom to Guy would be a grave mistake, potentially leading to its ruin. In 1183, a year after stripping Guy of the Regency, Baldwin made another critical decision regarding the succession. He crowned Sibylla's young son, his nephew, Baldwin V, as co-king. This was an unprecedented move, a desperate attempt to secure the future of the kingdom. The young Baldwin V, still a child, was placed under the guardianship of Raymond III of Tripoli, a move designed to bypass Guy's influence and ensure a more stable regency. This act was a testament to Baldwin IV's foresight and his deep concern for the kingdom's future, even as his own present became increasingly agonizing. It was also a clear signal to the court that Guy was not to be his successor. The crowning of Baldwin V as co-king, while seemingly a solution, only further complicated the political landscape. It created a situation with three potential claimants to the throne: the ailing Baldwin IV, the young co-king Baldwin V, and Sibylla, the mother of Baldwin V and wife of the ambitious Guy. This intricate web of succession, born out of necessity and the king's deteriorating health, laid the groundwork for further instability and ultimately for the tragic events that would follow. The quiet, almost invisible progression of Baldwin's illness had by now become impossible to ignore. The initial numbness had given way to more severe symptoms. The skin on his face and limbs began to thicken and disfigure, his hands and feet slowly losing their form. The constant pain, though often masked by his remarkable resilience, was a relentless companion. He was no longer able to ride a horse, a profound loss for a knightly king, and was instead carried on a litter, a stark visual representation of his physical decline. Yet even from this prone position, he continued to issue commands, to receive emissaries, and to make decisions that shaped the destiny of his kingdom. The once proud warrior who had led his knights into battle was now a figure of profound vulnerability. Yet, paradoxically, his suffering seemed to amplify his moral authority in the eyes of many. He was the suffering king, bearing the burden of his illness with a quiet dignity, his unwavering faith a source of inspiration. Perhaps these walls whispered stories to the stars, not just of battles and treaties, but of a king's quiet endurance, of his fierce love for his kingdom, even as his body failed him. The scent of incense from the nearby churches, the distant cries of street vendors, the gentle rustle of silks in the palace halls, all continued, but now beneath the shadow of a king's relentless struggle against an unseen enemy within. The political machinations continued, a relentless undercurrent, as the factions vied for position. Knowing that the king's time was drawing to a close, and with it, the opportunity to seize the reins of power. The stage was being set for the final, tragic acts of Baldwin IV's reign, acts that would forever alter the fate of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. The desert winds, so often a herald of conflict, sometimes carried whispers of a different kind, of exhaustion, of the sheer human cost of perpetual war. Even for two such formidable adversaries as Baldwin and Saladin, there came moments when the desire for a respite, however temporary, outweighed the thirst for immediate victory. It was in these lulls, these fleeting breathers in the ceaseless struggle, that the fragile hope of truce might bloom. Baldwin, ever pragmatic and keenly aware of the precarious state of his kingdom, understood that peace, even a fleeting one, was a strategic necessity. His resources, both in coin and in fighting men, were not limitless, and the long campaigns had taken their toll. Saladin, too, had his own vast empire to manage, his own internal dissenters to quell, and the constant drain of the Jerusalem campaigns was a burden even for his expansive domain. Thus, in the year 1180, a significant truce was indeed brokered between the two leaders. It was not a peace treaty in the modern sense, not an end to all hostilities, but rather a cessation of large-scale military operations, an agreement to allow trade and safe passage, to permit the flow of pilgrims without fear of ambush. For a time, the roads that crisscrossed the Holy Land, so often stained with blood, saw caravans moving freely, their bells chiming a temporary melody of commerce rather than conflict. Pilgrims, their hearts alight with devotion, could journey to the sacred sites with a diminished sense of dread, their prayers rising unhindered by the clang of swords. This truce was a testament to the mutual respect that surprisingly existed between Baldwin and Saladin, a respect born not of affection, but of recognition of each other's formidable capabilities and the shared understanding of the weariness of war. It was a fragile thing, woven from necessity and mutual exhaustion, yet for a brief period, it allowed the land to breathe. But the intricate tapestry of peace, so painstakingly woven by the hands of kings, could be unraveled by the reckless threads of lesser men. Among the Frankish nobility, there were those who chafed under the constraints of any truce, their minds still fixed on the glory of battle, the lure of plunder, or perhaps a genuine but misguided conviction that only constant aggression could secure the kingdom. Chief among these disruptive forces was Reynald of Chatillon. Reynald was a figure of immense charisma and daring, but also of profound impulsiveness and a startling disregard for established agreements. He had a long and controversial history, having spent years as a prisoner in Aleppo, an experience that perhaps hardened his heart and fueled a deep-seated animosity towards Saladin and the Muslim world. His stronghold, the formidable Kerak, perched high above the desert plains, gave him a strategic vantage point over the lucrative trade routes that linked Egypt with Damascus and the northern lands. These routes, vital arteries of Saladin's empire, were precisely what the truce was meant to protect. Reynald, however, saw not a protected trade route, but an opportunity. In 1181, barely a year after the truce had been agreed upon, he launched an audacious raid. He did not attack a military convoy, but a large, richly laden caravan of merchants and pilgrims, traveling peacefully under the terms of the truce. This was not a skirmish. It was an act of brigandage, a blatant violation of the solemn agreement. The goods were seized, the travelers imprisoned, and many were reportedly killed. This act was not merely a breach of peace. It was a profound insult, a direct challenge to Saladin's honor and authority. Saladin, a man who valued his word and expected others to do the same, was incensed. He immediately dispatched envoys to Jerusalem, demanding the release of the captives and the return of the stolen goods. Baldwin, upon hearing of Reynald's actions, was faced with a terrible dilemma. He understood the gravity of the transgression. He knew that Reynald's actions jeopardized not only the truce, but the very credibility of the Crusader kingdom. To condone such an act was to invite Saladin's wrath. To punish Reynald, a powerful and popular baron, risked internal strife. Historians still debate the precise extent of Baldwin's authority over his often rebellious vassals. Was he genuinely unable to compel Reynald to comply? Or did his own weakening health and the complex web of feudal loyalties make such an enforcement politically impossible? Whatever the reason, Baldwin sent his own envoys to Reynald, urging him to release the prisoners and return the plunder. But Reynald, defiant and unrepentant, refused. He famously declared that he recognized no king but God, and that he would plunder whom he pleased. This open defiance, a direct challenge to both Baldwin's authority and the delicate diplomatic balance, left Baldwin in an impossible position. Saladin, his patience exhausted, responded with swift and decisive action. He launched a punitive raid into the kingdom, laying waste to the lands around Montreal and Carrick, targeting Reynald's territories directly. This was not yet a full-scale invasion, but a clear message, a demonstration of Saladin's resolve and his willingness to retaliate for such flagrant breaches of trust. The fragile truce, so recently established, lay shattered, its pieces scattered by Reynald's reckless hand. The cycle of truce and betrayal, of cautious diplomacy and impulsive aggression, would repeat itself. In 1182, another truce was negotiated, again born of mutual exhaustion after a series of minor skirmishes. And again, Reynald of Châtillon proved to be the destructive force. This time, his ambition reached even further. He constructed a small fleet of ships and transported them, in pieces, across the desert to the Gulf of Aqaba, where they were reassembled. His plan was audacious: to raid the holy cities of Islam, Mecca and Medina, to disrupt the annual pilgrimage, and to strike at the very heart of Saladin's religious authority. This was an act of profound provocation, an assault not just on trade or territory, but on the deeply held spiritual beliefs of an entire civilization. The Muslim world was outraged. Saladin, who had always presented himself as the champion of Islam, felt this as a deeply personal affront. His forces intercepted Reynald's fleet, destroying it and capturing many of his men. Those captured were reportedly executed, a testament to the extreme anger Reynald's actions had provoked. This incident, perhaps more than any other, cemented Saladin's determination to eliminate Reynald and, by extension, to reclaim Jerusalem. For Saladin, the continued existence of such a disruptive and sacrilegious force within the Crusader kingdom became intolerable. Baldwin, watching these events unfold from Jerusalem, must have felt a profound sense of despair. His kingdom, already weakened by internal divisions and the insidious advance of his illness, was being dragged closer to the precipice of total war by the very men who were sworn to protect it. He recognized the profound danger Reynald posed, not just to Saladin, but to the continued existence of the Latin East. Yet his ability to control his most powerful and independent vassals was increasingly limited. The feudal system, designed to provide strength through decentralized power, now threatened to tear the kingdom apart from within. The barons, each with their own castles, their own retinues, and their own ambitions, often acted as independent lords, sometimes even waging private wars against each other, further depleting the kingdom's already strained resources. The political landscape of the Crusader states was a complex web of rivalries and alliances. There was the court faction, generally loyal to Baldwin and advocating for diplomacy and strategic defense. And then the more aggressive war party, often led by figures like Reynold and Guy of Lucy, Guinan, who favored constant offensive action and less restraint. Baldwin, despite his personal courage and strategic acumen, found himself increasingly caught in the middle, his authority undermined by his deteriorating health and the sheer intransigence of some of his most powerful subjects. He understood that a decisive confrontation with Saladin was inevitable unless a lasting peace could be forged, and Reynold's actions made such a peace impossible. Perhaps these walls whispered stories to the stars of a king who, despite his suffering, fought tirelessly to hold his kingdom together, only to see his efforts undermined by the very men he was meant to lead. The constant cycle of raids and retaliations, of truces made and truces broken, sapped the strength of both sides, but it was the smaller, more vulnerable Crusader kingdom that felt the strain most acutely. Each broken truce meant more lives lost, more resources expended, and a deeper erosion of trust between the two great powers of the Levant. The strategic advantage that Baldwin had so skillfully maintained through his earlier victories was slowly being chipped away, not by Saladin's overwhelming force, but by the internal failings and reckless ambitions of his own nobility. As the year 1182 drew to a close, the air in the Holy Land was thick with foreboding. The brief periods of quiet, the fleeting moments when trade flourished and pilgrims walked in relative safety, were now distant memories. Reynold's repeated provocations had ensured that Saladin's gaze was fixed firmly on the Crusader kingdom, his determination to eradicate this disruptive presence growing with each audacious act. The truce, once a fragile bridge over troubled waters, had been burned, leaving only the chasm of inevitable conflict. Baldwin, his body growing weaker, his vision perhaps blurring at the edges, could see the storm gathering on the horizon. The question was no longer if war would come, but when, and whether his ailing kingdom, fractured by internal dissent and external aggression, could possibly withstand the full fury of Saladin's unleashed might. The stage was set for the final devastating confrontation, a confrontation that Baldwin, despite his profound efforts, had been unable to avert. As the years wore on, the shadow of illness deepened around Baldwin IV, and the relentless march of leprosy began to claim more of his strength, more of his youthful vigor. The once bright eyes, though still keen with intellect and determination, now often held a weariness that belied his age. His hands, once capable of wielding a sword or signing a decree, grew increasingly gnarled and painful, making even the simplest tasks a profound struggle. The very air of the court, though outwardly bustling with the affairs of state, was subtly permeated by an undercurrent of anxiety, a growing apprehension about the future of the kingdom. All eyes, it seemed, turned not just to the ailing king, but to the question that hung heavy in the opulent halls and sun-drenched courtyards: who would succeed him? Baldwin, ever pragmatic and deeply devoted to the survival of Jerusalem, understood this unspoken concern better than anyone. He knew that a stable succession was paramount, especially given the ever-present threat from Saladin, whose power continued to consolidate across the Muslim world. The prospect of a prolonged regency or a disputed claim to the throne could shatter the fragile unity of the Crusader states, leaving them vulnerable to an inevitable onslaught. His own illness, which had once been a closely guarded secret, was now an undeniable reality, forcing him to confront the grim truth that his reign, however valiant, would not be long. The most direct line of succession lay with his sister, Sibylla. She was the elder of his two sisters, a woman of strong will and, by all accounts, considerable charm. Yet the idea of a queen ruling alone was a relatively new and often contentious concept in the feudal societies of the 12th century, particularly in a kingdom perpetually on a war footing. A queen needed a king consort, a strong hand to lead armies and administer justice. Sibylla's first marriage had been to William Longsword, the Marquis of Montferrat, a union arranged by Baldwin himself in 1176. It was a marriage that promised a powerful alliance with a prominent European noble family, and it had indeed produced a son, Baldwin, born in 1177. But tragedy had struck swiftly. William had died within months of their marriage, leaving Sibylla a young widow and her infant son fatherless. This young boy, Baldwin, Sibylla's son, was the king's nephew, and as such represented the next generation of the royal lineage. He was a small child, innocent of the immense burdens that would soon be placed upon his tiny shoulders. The king, observing his nephew, perhaps saw a flicker of his own youth, a poignant reminder of the path he himself had been forced to walk at an equally tender age. The question then became, who would Sibylla marry next? Her choice of husband would effectively become the next king, and therefore the protector of the realm and the young heir. This decision was not merely personal. It was a matter of state, fraught with political intrigue and competing factions within the court. There were those who championed a local noble, someone deeply invested in the kingdom's welfare, like Raymond III of Tripoli, who had served as regent during Baldwin IV's minority. Others looked to Europe, hoping for another powerful alliance that would bring much-needed military aid and prestige. In 1180, Baldwin IV orchestrated Sibylla's second marriage, a decision that would prove to be one of the most controversial and ultimately tragic of his reign. He chose Guy of Lusignan, a Poitevin knight from a relatively minor noble family in France, whose brother, Aimery, was already a prominent figure in the kingdom. The king's reasons for this choice are still debated by historians. Some suggest it was a deliberate move to curb the growing power of Raymond III of Tripoli and the Abilin family, who represented a rival faction at court. Others believe Baldwin saw in Guy a potential strong leader, someone who could command respect and defend the king. Nictum. Still others posit that it was a desperate gamble, a choice made under immense pressure, and perhaps influenced by the king's failing health and his desire to secure a future for his nephew. Regardless of the exact motivations, the marriage was deeply unpopular with many of the native nobility, who viewed Guy as an outsider, ambitious, and lacking the necessary experience or gravitas for such a crucial role. With Guy now firmly established as Sibylla's husband, and thus a potential claimant to the throne, the succession picture became even more complex. Baldwin, increasingly incapacitated by his disease, made a pivotal decision in 1183. Recognizing that he could not continue to rule effectively and fearing a power vacuum upon his death, he had his young nephew Baldwin V crowned as co-king. This was an extraordinary measure, a desperate attempt to ensure a smooth transition and to bypass Guy of Lusignan, whom the king had come to distrust deeply. The co-coronation, a rare event in medieval Europe, was a clear signal that the child was the designated heir and that any regency would be temporary, merely holding the throne until the boy came of age. The anointing of Baldwin V was a solemn affair held in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The small boy, perhaps bewildered by the weight of the crown and the solemnity of the ceremony, was elevated to a position of immense responsibility. His mother, Sibylla, was present, her heart undoubtedly a mix of pride and profound anxiety for her son's future. The young co-king was placed under the regency of Raymond III of Tripoli, a move that further alienated Guy and Sibylla, who felt their rightful claim was being usurped. This decision, while intended to stabilize the kingdom, instead intensified the factionalism within the Crusader court, creating a deep rift between the king's chosen regents and his sister and brother-in-law. As Baldwin IV's health continued to decline, his suffering became more profound. His sight was failing, and the pain in his limbs was constant. Yet even in his agony, his mind remained sharp, his concern for Jerusalem unwavering. He continued to participate in councils, offering advice and issuing decrees, his voice perhaps weaker, but his resolve as strong as ever. There are accounts of him being carried on a litter to review troops or attend important meetings, his presence alone a testament to his indomitable spirit. Perhaps these moments, where he faced his people and his nobles, were not just acts of duty, but also a quiet assertion of his continued authority, a desperate attempt to hold the kingdom together through sheer force of will, even as his body betrayed him. The political machinations surrounding the succession continued unabated. The tension between the various factions, the Lusignans, the Ibelins, Raymond of Tripoli, was palpable, a silent battle for influence that overshadowed the more immediate threat from Saladin. This internal strife was a constant source of frustration for Baldwin, who understood that unity was their only hope. He had dedicated his life to defending Jerusalem, and now, even on his deathbed, he was forced to witness the very people he sought to protect tearing themselves apart. In 1185, at the age of just 24, Baldwin IV finally succumbed to his disease. His death marked the end of an extraordinary and tragic reign. He had defied expectations, ruling for over a decade despite an illness that should have claimed him much sooner. His passing plunged the kingdom into a period of acute uncertainty. The young Baldwin V, now the sole king, was a frail child, and he too was ailing. He would reign for only a year, dying in 1186, likely from illness, though whispers of poisoning circulated at the time, adding another layer of intrigue and suspicion to the already fraught political climate. With the death of Baldwin V, the direct male line of succession was extinguished. The crown now undeniably fell to Sibylla. Her burden was immense. She was not only a grieving mother and sister, but now the queen regnant of a kingdom teetering on the brink of collapse. The nobility, still divided, had to decide whether to accept her as queen in her own right or to insist on a king consort. Sibylla, demonstrating a shrewd political acumen that perhaps surprised some, played her hand carefully. She agreed to be crowned queen, but only on the condition that she could choose her own husband. Once crowned, she immediately placed the crown upon the head of Guy of Lusignan, declaring him king. This act, while fulfilling her earlier promise, was a clear assertion of her own authority and a defiant act against those who had sought to control her choice. It solidified Guy's position, but it also cemented the divisions within the kingdom, as many nobles, including Raymond III of Tripoli and Balian of Ibelin, refused to acknowledge Guy as king, believing him to be an unsuitable ruler. The period immediately following Baldwin IV's death and the subsequent ascension of Sibylla and Guy was characterized by a dangerous lack of unity. While Baldwin had managed, through sheer force of personality and strategic alliances, to maintain a fragile peace with Saladin for much of his later reign. The new rulers lacked his diplomatic skill and military prowess. Guy, in particular, proved to be an ineffective leader, prone to rash decisions and unable to command the respect of the various factions. The legacy of Baldwin IV, therefore, extends beyond his own reign. His decisions regarding the succession, born of a desperate need to secure Jerusalem's future, inadvertently set the stage for the kingdom's most catastrophic defeat. The internal feuds, exacerbated by the controversial marriage of Sibylla and Guy, weakened the kingdom precisely when it needed to be strongest. Historians still debate whether a different succession plan, perhaps one that had elevated Raymond III of Tripoli to the throne, could have averted the disaster that was to come. Some argue that the internal divisions were too deeply entrenched and that the kingdom was doomed regardless, given Saladin's overwhelming strength. Others contend that a more unified leadership could have bought Jerusalem more time, perhaps even negotiated a more favorable peace. Sibylla, as queen, faced an impossible task. She inherited a kingdom riddled with internal strife, led by a husband who was widely distrusted, and facing an external enemy of unprecedented power. Her reign, tragically short, would culminate in the devastating Battle of Hattin in year 1187, where the Crusader army was annihilated by Saladin's forces, and Guy of Lusignan was captured. This defeat opened the gates of Jerusalem to Saladin, leading to its fall just a few months later. Sibylla herself would die of plague in 1190, a queen who had borne the immense burden of her family's legacy and the kingdom's survival, only to witness its ultimate demise. The story of Baldwin IV, the Leper King, is thus inextricably linked to the tragic fates of his sister Sibylla and his young nephew Baldwin V. It is a narrative woven with threads of courage, political intrigue, familial duty, and the relentless march of destiny. The succession crises that plagued his final years were not merely political squabbles. They were desperate attempts to secure the future of a fragile kingdom, attempts that ultimately proved insufficient against the tide of history and the formidable power of Saladin. The whispers of the wind through the ancient stones of Jerusalem, perhaps, still carry echoes of the king's final prayers for his people, and the heavy sigh of a sister burdened by a crown of thorns. The relentless march of the disease continued, stripping away not just Baldwin's strength, but his very form. His face, once handsome despite its youth, became a mask of disfigurement. The once clear eyes now clouded. His voice, a struggle against the ravages within. Yet, from this failing vessel, the spirit of a king continued to burn with an almost defiant intensity. He was a monarch, bound to his throne, not by the weight of a crown, but by the weight of a dying kingdom, and a personal courage that transcended the agony of his flesh. Even as his physical capabilities diminished, Baldwin's mind remained remarkably sharp, his strategic acumen undimmed. He understood with chilling clarity that his time was short, and that the future of Jerusalem, already precarious, would soon rest in other hands. His primary concern now shifted from active military campaigns to securing a stable succession, a task made infinitely more complex by the rivalries simmering within his own court. The very people who should have been his staunchest allies often proved to be his greatest challenge. One of the most pressing issues was the regency for his young nephew, Baldwin V. The boy was the son of Sibylla and William of Montferrat, and though he had been crowned co-king in the year 1183, the question of who would truly govern in the event of Baldwin IV's death loomed large. The king had initially appointed Guy of Lusignan as regent, a decision that proved disastrous. Guy's incompetence and arrogance were a constant source of frustration, culminating in his dismissal after his refusal to engage Saladin at the Springs of Cresson. This particular incident, where Guy's inaction allowed Saladin to consolidate his forces and raid deep into Frankish territory, highlighted the critical need for a strong, decisive leader. Baldwin, recognizing his own fading strength and Guy's unsuitability, was forced to make a series of difficult choices. He annulled Sibylla's marriage to Guy, a bold and controversial move, and then, in a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of control, arranged for Sibylla to marry a more capable lord of her choosing, provided she agreed to divorce Guy. This she did, but then, with a surprising act of defiance and loyalty, she immediately remarried Guy, effectively restoring him to a position of power. This turn of events was a bitter pill for the ailing king, who had hoped to circumvent Guy's influence. It illustrates the complex web of personal loyalties and political maneuvering that constantly undermined his efforts to secure the kingdom. The year 1183 saw Saladin once again probing the kingdom's defenses, launching a major offensive towards Beirut. Baldwin, despite his severe illness, felt compelled to lead his army. He was so weakened that he had to be carried on a litter, his body racked with pain, yet his presence was a powerful symbol to his troops. This remarkable act of leadership, even from a stretcher, rallied the Frankish forces and deterred Saladin from a full-scale assault on the city. The Sultan, perhaps sensing the king's indomitable will, or perhaps wary of a protracted siege, eventually withdrew. This was one of Baldwin's last direct military engagements, a testament to his enduring resolve, even as his body failed him. The king's declining health also brought to the forefront the issue of succession. With no children of his own and his condition worsening, the question of who would inherit the throne became paramount. His sister, Sibylla, and her husband, Guy of Lusignan, were one faction. His half-sister, Isabella, and her husband, Humphrey IV of Turan, represented another. These factions, often at odds, created a deeply unstable political environment. Historians still debate the extent to which these internal rivalries contributed to the eventual fall of Jerusalem. Some argue that the constant bickering and lack of unified leadership were as damaging as Saladin's military might, while others emphasize the overwhelm. Enabling numerical superiority of the Ayyubid forces, Baldwin, ever the pragmatist, understood that the kingdom needed a strong, undisputed ruler, and that his own continued presence, while inspiring, was also a source of tension. He sought to solidify the position of his nephew, Baldwin V, appointing Raymond III of Tripoli as regent for the young boy. Raymond was a seasoned and respected leader, and Baldwin hoped that his experience would provide the stability needed to navigate the treacherous political landscape. This appointment was a deliberate attempt to sideline Guy of Lusignan, whose ambition and poor judgment Baldwin had come to distrust deeply. The king's final years were marked by a profound sense of urgency. He knew the kingdom was living on borrowed time. He understood that Saladin, patient and calculating, was merely waiting for the right moment, for the Frankish defenses to weaken, for internal strife to consume them. Baldwin had repeatedly sought aid from the West, sending envoys to European monarchs, painting a stark picture of the imminent danger. Yet, the response was always lukewarm, a trickle of funds and a few knights, never the full-scale crusade that was desperately needed. The European powers were too embroiled in their own dynastic struggles and internal politics to fully grasp the existential threat facing the Latin East. One particularly poignant detail from this period is the king's increasing reliance on his inner circle. As his eyesight failed and his mobility became severely limited, he depended on trusted advisors to read documents to him, to describe the faces of those who came to him, and to physically assist him in moving from place to place. The once vibrant king was now confined, his world shrinking, yet his mind remained fixed on the fate of his kingdom. He would spend hours in council, his voice often raspy, his body aching, but his intellect sharp, dissecting reports, planning strategies, and attempting to mend the ever-present rifts among his nobles. The disease, now in its advanced stages, consumed him. His limbs began to fail, his vision blurred, and the pain became constant. By late 1184 and early 1185, Baldwin was almost completely blind and unable to use his hands or feet. He was a king in name, a symbol of resistance, but his body was a prison. Yet, even in this state, he continued to issue decrees, to meet with his council, and to participate in the governance of his realm. The sheer force of his will was astonishing, a testament to a man who refused to surrender to his affliction, even as it consumed him. His last public act of significance was likely the formal transfer of power to Raymond of Tripoli as regent and the reaffirmation of Baldwin V as his successor. This was a desperate attempt to ensure a smooth transition and prevent Guy of Lusignan from seizing control immediately upon his death. The ceremony, likely held in the royal palace, would have been a somber affair, with the young, frail Baldwin V standing beside his uncle, the Leper King, whose once strong body was now visibly decaying. It was a poignant tableau, symbolizing both the fragility and the enduring hope of the Crusader states. The end came in March 1185. Baldwin IV, the Leper King, succumbed to his illness at the age of 24. His reign, though short, had been one of constant struggle, marked by remarkable courage and an unwavering dedication to his kingdom. He had held the line against Saladin for over a decade, a feat that many believed impossible given his condition. His death plunged the kingdom into an even deeper crisis. The young Baldwin V, his successor, was a sickly child, and his reign was destined to be tragically brief. The passing of Baldwin IV marked the true beginning of the end for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He had been the last strong, unifying figure, a king who, despite his immense personal suffering, had commanded respect and instilled a sense of purpose. With his demise, the fragile unity he had painstakingly maintained began to unravel. The internal feuds which he had suppressed or managed through sheer force of will now erupted with renewed ferocity. The stage was set for the catastrophic events that would follow, leading to the crushing defeat at Hattin and the subsequent fall of Jerusalem just 2 years later. The kingdom had lost its protector, its guiding light, and the hope that had flickered so bravely under his reign began to fade into the encroaching shadows. Perhaps as the news of his death spread through the Holy Land, the very stones of Jerusalem seemed to sigh, sensing the inevitable tide of change that was about to engulf them. The silence that followed Baldwin IV's passing on May 16, 1185, was not one of peace, but of a held breath, a kingdom poised on the precipice. He had, with extraordinary will, held the fracturing pieces of Jerusalem together, but his death removed the last, albeit ailing, keystone. The crown, as was his final decree, passed to his young nephew, Baldwin V, a child of barely 7 years, jointly crowned with his mother, Sibylla, and under the regency of Count Raymond III of Tripoli. This arrangement, a fragile compromise born of the king's dying wish, was intended to prevent the kingdom from tearing itself apart. Yet the seeds of discord had been too deeply sown, and the young king's reign would prove to be tragically brief, a mere placeholder in the unfolding drama. Raymond III, a seasoned statesman and military leader, was perhaps the most capable figure to guide the kingdom through its perilous straits. He understood the precarious balance of power, the necessity of peace with Saladin, and the deep divisions within the Frankish nobility. His regency, however, was immediately fraught with suspicion. The Lusignan faction, led by Guy and his brother Aimery, viewed Raymond with profound distrust, seeing him as a rival to Sibylla's claim and a potential usurper. They had never forgiven him for his opposition to Guy's marriage to Sibylla, nor for his perceived ambition during Baldwin IV's final years. This internal strife, a festering wound within the kingdom's leadership, would prove far more destructive than any external threat. The young Baldwin V, frail and sickly, was a king in name only. His brief reign was a period of increasing tension and political maneuvering, a desperate scramble for power beneath the veneer of regency. Raymond, attempting to stabilize the kingdom, renewed the truce with Saladin, a pragmatic decision that bought precious time but further alienated the more hawkish elements of the nobility, who saw it as a sign of weakness. This period, from 1185 to 1186, was a deceptive calm, a gathering storm. The truce, set to expire in 1187, was a ticking clock, and the Frankish leaders, instead of uniting, continued to squabble over succession and personal grievances. Then, in the summer of 1186, the inevitable tragedy struck. Baldwin V, the child king, succumbed to illness, his young life extinguished as quickly as it had begun. His death plunged the kingdom into an immediate and profound constitutional crisis. Who would rule now? The succession, carefully orchestrated by Baldwin IV, hinged on a council of nobles, the Patriarch, and the Grand Masters of the military orders, who were to decide between Sibylla and Isabella, her half-sister. But the carefully laid plans unraveled in the face of raw ambition. Sibylla, seizing the moment, acted decisively. Supported by Jocelyn III of Edessa, the Patriarch Heraclius, and the Grand Masters of the Temple and the Hospital, she moved quickly to secure her claim. Raymond III, who had left Jerusalem for his stronghold in Tiberias, was outmaneuvered. Sibylla, crowned queen, then made a move that shocked many and decisively shifted the balance of power. She crowned her husband, Guy of Lusignan, as king consort. This act, a direct defiance of Baldwin IV's dying wishes and the established succession protocols, ignited the final, fatal schism within the kingdom. The coronation of Guy was a catastrophe in the making. His military incompetence and political ineptitude were well known, and his elevation to the throne was seen by many, including Raymond III, as an unforgivable betrayal of the kingdom's interests. Raymond, in a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, convened a counter-council and proposed Isabella, Baldwin IV's half-sister, and her husband, Humphrey IV of Turan, as alternative rulers. However, Humphrey, perhaps out of a sense of loyalty or fear of further civil strife, refused to press his claim, effectively scuttling Raymond's efforts. This left the kingdom with two irreconcilable factions, those who supported Guy and Sibylla, and those who saw Raymond as the legitimate leader, or at least the lesser of two evils. The kingdom, now under the nominal rule of Guy, was more divided than ever. Raymond III, refusing to acknowledge Guy as king, retreated to his fiefdom in Tiberias, effectively creating a state within a state. He even, in a move that historians still debate the true intent of, made a separate truce with Saladin, further isolating himself from the royal court in Jerusalem. Was this a desperate measure to protect his lands, a cynical power play, or a genuine attempt to preserve peace in the face of Guy's recklessness? The motivations remain shrouded in the political machinations of the time. Some chroniclers suggest Raymond was even considering an alliance with Saladin against Guy, a notion that underscores the depth of the internal animosity. Guy, now king, proved to be every bit as disastrous as his detractors had feared. His reign was marked by a series of provocations against Saladin, most notably by Renaud of Châtillon, Lord of Ultre-Jourdain. Renaud, a notorious brigand and opportunist, repeatedly violated the truce by attacking Muslim caravans, even those under Saladin's direct protection. These raids, driven by greed and a profound disregard for the fragile peace, were a direct challenge to Saladin's authority and honor. Guy, either unwilling or unable to control Renaud, allowed these provocations to continue, effectively dismantling the delicate diplomatic framework that Baldwin IV and Raymond III had painstakingly built. Saladin, a man of immense patience and strategic acumen, had long bided his time. He understood the internal weaknesses of the Frankish kingdom, the constant bickering, and the lack of a unified command. He had seen Baldwin IV's strength and respected it, but he saw only weakness and disunity in Guy. Renaud's repeated transgressions, particularly the attack on a caravan that included Saladin's own sister, provided the perfect casus belli. Saladin, now free from the truce and with a clear justification for war, began to mobilize his forces on an unprecedented scale. The Frankish kingdom, despite the looming threat, remained stubbornly divided. Guy, eager to prove his military prowess and assert his authority, called for a general levy. Raymond III, initially reluctant, eventually joined the royal army, persuaded by the pleas of the Patriarch Heraclius and the Grand Masters, who emphasized the existential threat facing the kingdom. His decision, perhaps a final act of loyalty to the Crusader cause despite his disdain for Guy, brought a measure of unity, but it was too little, too late. The deep-seated mistrust between Guy and Raymond persisted, a silent wedge driven through the heart of the command structure. The combined Frankish army, a motley collection of knights, foot soldiers, and mercenaries, set out from the springs of Sepphoris in the scorching July heat of 1187. Their objective, to relieve the siege of Tiberias, Raymond's stronghold, which Saladin was now attacking. The decision to march across the arid, waterless plains of Galilee, rather than taking a more circuitous but well-watered route, was a fatal error. Historians still debate who was ultimately responsible for this disastrous choice. Was it Guy's rashness or Raymond's advice, perhaps given under duress, that led them into this trap? Some accounts suggest Raymond, despite his animosity, warned against the march, but Guy, influenced by Renaud and others, insisted on the direct route. The march itself was an agonizing ordeal. The Crusader army, burdened by heavy armor and parched by the relentless sun, quickly became dehydrated. Saladin's light cavalry, constantly harassing their flanks, picked off stragglers and prevented them from reaching any water sources. The air shimmered with heat, the dust rose in choking clouds, and the cries of thirst echoed across the desolate landscape. The Frankish army, once a formidable fighting force, was slowly being broken, not by direct combat, but by the elements and Saladin's strategic brilliance. As the sun set on July 3rd, 1187, the exhausted Crusader army, desperate for water, found themselves trapped in the parched hills surrounding the Horns of Hattin, two prominent volcanic mounds. Saladin's forces had encircled them, cutting off their access to the Sea of Galilee, a mere few miles away. The night was filled with the sounds of Saladin's army celebrating, their drums beating, their voices echoing across the hills, a terrifying prelude to the battle to come. The Frankish camp, meanwhile, was a scene of despair, their thirst unquenchable, their spirits flagging. The dawn of July 4th, 1187, broke over a scene of impending doom. The Crusader army, weakened and demoralized, faced Saladin's fresh, well-hydrated forces. The ensuing battle was less a contest and more a massacre. The Frankish knights, despite their legendary courage, were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers and superior tactics of Saladin's army. The true cross, carried into battle as a sacred relic, was captured, a symbolic blow that resonated throughout Christendom. Raymond III, recognizing the futility of the situation, managed to break through Saladin's lines with a small contingent of his knights, escaping the carnage. But for the vast majority of the Crusader army, there was no escape. Guy of Lusignan, Reynald of Chatillon, and many other prominent nobles were captured. Saladin, in a chilling act of retribution, personally executed Reynald of Chatillon for his repeated breaches of truce and his blasphemous attacks on Muslim pilgrims. Guy, spared but humiliated, was a king without a kingdom, his reign ending in utter disaster. The Battle of Hattin was not merely a defeat. It was an annihilation. The flower of the Frankish nobility was either dead or captured, the military orders decimated, and the kingdom left virtually defenseless. The immediate aftermath of Hattin was swift and brutal. With no army to defend them, the cities and castles of the Kingdom of Jerusalem fell one by one to Saladin's triumphant forces. Acre, Sidon, Beirut, Jaffa, Ascalon, all capitulated within weeks. The great fortresses that had once seemed impregnable now stood empty, their garrisons destroyed at Hattin. The fall of Jerusalem itself, the holy city, was inevitable. On October 2nd, 1187, Saladin entered Jerusalem after a brief siege, ending 88 years of Frankish rule. The golden cross that had adorned the Dome of the Rock was pulled down, and the Muslim call to prayer once again echoed through the city's ancient stones. The legacy of Baldwin IV, the Leper King, in the face of this catastrophe, becomes even more poignant. He had staved off this very outcome for a decade, holding back the tide through sheer force of will, diplomatic cunning, and military prowess. His death, however, removed the only figure capable of uniting the fractious Frankish nobility and maintaining a precarious peace with Saladin. The regency and succession disputes that followed his passing, the elevation of the incompetent Guy of Lusignan, and the fatal decision to march to Hattin were all direct consequences of the power vacuum and internal divisions that Baldwin had so desperately tried to manage. He did not live to see the fall of Jerusalem, but the events that led to its demise were set in motion the moment his extraordinary life came to an end. The kingdom he had fought so valiantly to preserve, a fragile beacon in a hostile land, had finally crumbled, not from the external pressure of Saladin alone, but from the deep-seated rot of its own internal strife. The autumn of 1185 saw Jerusalem shrouded in a quiet apprehension. Baldwin IV, the young king who had defied death and disease for so long, was fading. His body, once strong enough to lead charges, was now ravaged beyond recognition. His face disfigured, his hands and feet useless. Yet even in his final days, his mind remained sharp, his will unbroken. He had for years been the true, if silent, architect of his kingdom's defense, a bulwark against the rising tide of Saladin's power. His reign, though tragically short, had been a testament to extraordinary resilience, a period when a kingdom teetered on the brink but held firm, largely due to the sheer force of its king's spirit. Baldwin's final act of statesmanship was to secure the succession. Recognizing that his own life was nearing its end, and that his chosen heir, Baldwin V, was but a child, he appointed Raymond III of Tripoli as regent. Raymond, a seasoned and respected nobleman, was a pragmatic choice, one who understood the delicate balance of power in the Levant. This decision, made in the face of immense personal suffering, underscored Baldwin's unwavering commitment to his kingdom's future, even as his own present dissolved into pain. It was a moment of profound clarity, a king's last, desperate gamble to ensure stability. On March 16, 1185, Baldwin IV, the Leper King, breathed his last. He was just 24 years old. His death, though long anticipated, sent a tremor through the Crusader states. The young king, who had been a symbol of both hope and tragedy, was gone. His legacy, however, was far from over. He had, through sheer force of will, held the kingdom together against overwhelming odds. His victory at Montgisard in 1177, where a vastly outnumbered Frankish army routed Saladin's forces, remains one of the most astonishing military feats of the Crusader era. It was a battle where Baldwin, despite his burgeoning illness, led from the front, inspiring his men to an almost miraculous triumph. This singular victory bought the kingdom precious years, years that allowed it to survive, if precariously, in a hostile world. The immediate aftermath of Baldwin's death saw the fragile peace he had painstakingly maintained begin to unravel. The regency of Raymond III was challenged by the ambitious and often reckless Guy of Lusignan, husband of Baldwin's sister, Sibylla. Guy, who had previously served as regent during Baldwin's periods of incapacitation, had proven himself to be a divisive figure, often clashing with Raymond and other powerful nobles. This internal strife, a bitter fruit of the succession crisis Baldwin had tried so hard to avert, would prove to be devastating. Historians still debate whether Baldwin's choice of Raymond as regent was the best possible outcome, or if it merely delayed an inevitable power struggle that was already simmering beneath the surface of the kingdom's politics. Some argue that his efforts to bypass Guy were a desperate attempt to save the kingdom from a leader he distrusted, while others suggest that the seeds of discord were too deeply sown to be easily uprooted by any single decision. The young Baldwin V, the child king, did not long survive his uncle. He died in the summer of 1186, barely a year after ascending the throne. His death plunged the kingdom into an even deeper crisis. With no clear male heir, the path was cleared for Sibylla, Baldwin IV's sister, to claim the throne, and with her came Guy of Lusignan, who through his marriage to Sibylla became King of Jerusalem. This ascension marked a significant shift in the kingdom's leadership, away from the cautious diplomacy and strategic acumen that had characterized Baldwin IV's reign, and towards a more aggressive and less unified approach. The new reign of Guy of Lusignan was marked by a series of fateful missteps. Unlike Baldwin IV, who had understood the necessity of maintaining a delicate balance with Saladin, Guy often provoked the Ayyubid Sultan. One of the most egregious acts was the repeated raiding of Saladin's caravans by Reynald of Châtillon, a notoriously belligerent lord who operated from his fortress at Carac. These raids, in clear violation of existing truces, infuriated Saladin and provided him with the pretext he needed to launch a full-scale invasion. Baldwin IV had, in his lifetime, managed to rein in such provocations, understanding that the kingdom's survival depended on a careful avoidance of unnecessary conflict. His ability to project strength while simultaneously seeking diplomatic solutions was a hallmark of his rule, a nuanced approach that Guy seemed incapable of replicating. The fateful year of 1187 arrived, bringing with it the culmination of these tensions. Saladin, having amassed a vast army, moved to besiege Tiberias. Guy of Lusignan, against the counsel of Raymond III of Tripoli, made the catastrophic decision to march his entire army across the arid plains of Galilee to relieve the city. The march, undertaken in the scorching summer heat, was a grueling ordeal. The Frankish army, exhausted and parched, was cornered by Saladin's forces at the Horns of Hattin. The ensuing battle, fought on July 4th, 1187, was a complete and utter disaster for the Crusader forces. The army of Jerusalem was annihilated, its leadership captured or killed. King Guy was taken prisoner, along with many of the kingdom's most prominent knights. The Battle of Hattin effectively sealed the fate of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. With its army destroyed and its king imprisoned, the kingdom was left virtually defenseless. Saladin swept through the Crusader territories, capturing city after city with little resistance. Acre, Sidon, Beirut, and Ascalon all fell in quick succession. The climax came on October 2nd, 1187, when Jerusalem itself surrendered to Saladin after a brief siege. The Holy City, which had been in Christian hands for 88 years, was once again under Muslim rule. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves across Europe, prompting the call for the Third Crusade. The legacy of Baldwin IV, the Leper King, is inextricably linked to these events. His reign, marked by immense suffering, was also a period of remarkable resilience. He had, against all odds, kept the kingdom alive, his intelligence and courage compensating for his physical infirmities. He was a king who understood the precariousness of his position, the necessity of strong leadership, and the delicate balance required to survive in a hostile environment. His death removed the one figure capable of holding the disparate factions of the Crusader states together and of effectively countering Saladin's growing power. Perhaps if he had lived longer, or if his chosen successor had been allowed to rule, the kingdom might have avoided the catastrophic defeat at Hattin. But such counterfactuals are the whispers of history, unprovable and fleeting. Baldwin IV's story is not merely one of a king battling a terrible disease. It is the story of a kingdom battling for its very existence, guided by a monarch who refused to yield. He faced challenges that would have crushed lesser men, yet he continued to lead, to strategize, and to fight. His life was a testament to the power of the human spirit in the face of insurmountable odds. The complex moral and political challenges he faced, the internal squabbles among his nobles, the ever-present threat from Saladin. The burden of his own debilitating illness shaped his reign and ultimately the destiny of the Crusader states. His rule, though brief, left an indelible imprint, a poignant reminder of a time when a fragile Christian outpost in the East depended on the strength and wisdom of one extraordinary, suffering king. His memory, preserved in the chronicles of the age, stands as a beacon of unwavering determination against the encroaching shadows of fate.